The palm of his hand connected with the middle of her chest, and she was on the ground, mud soaking into her skirts. She must remember not to stand near a puddle when she playfully called James a coward. Still, this escapade was nearly worth the inevitable scolding. "You've lost your wits if you think I'm going to ride that horse," James said as Molly rose from the puddle and began to wring out her skirts. "Considering who owns her." "You haven't been listening in church, James. Don't you know all God's creatures are free?" "That horse isn't," James said. "Least not as far as Rutherford is concerned." They were standing on the edge of a pasture. Nearby, ignoring them while she cropped grass and let out the occasional contented whinny, was a bay mare. Most of the males Molly knew, and James especially, were wiry rather than muscular. So was she. She'd lugged enough firewood in her time and carried bags full of laundry, pails of water. The creature in the field, though, was different. Hard to believe she was the same type of animal as the cart horses that trudged the same streets as Molly, with their bones visible under the skin of their haunches. Whenever Molly passed this particular patch of grass, she would stand and stare at the mare's chest, at the bulges of muscle under the sleek brown hair. She reckoned this animal was probably the strongest creature she had ever seen. And unlike the average cart horse, which flinched on occasion when approached, this girl had no need to fear a human voice. She was the pride of Mr. Rutherford, the local magistrate, who would ride her sedately through the streets of Bury, pretending not to be aware of the envious glances. Molly had once squeezed herself under the fence at the edge of the pasture. She had wanted to put her hand on the chest, find out whether the mare's muscles were as pillowy as they looked. She had never ridden a horse, although she dimly remembered her father lifting her onto one of the cart horses, holding her as she giggled and bounced. Molly couldn't quite remember what her father looked like now. She remembered his hands, though, under her arms, hoisting her up. His cackle, which matched her giggles. The feel of his whiskers under her hands when he lifted her onto his shoulders. And she looped her arms around his neck. So when her grandmother told her she was just like him, she wasn't sure what the old woman meant. She was fairly certain, though, that it wasn't intended as a compliment. "He would have ended on one of them boats," Mrs. Darrow, as Molly Darrow was required to address her grandmother, would say. Molly knew which boats she meant. They did, on occasion, travel the 9 miles to Manchester, where her grandmother would take her to the river, standing on the bank with the little girl who had been foisted onto her, and looking at the strange squat ships that weren't ships, their masts lopped off like a soldier's arm. It was an ignoble end for a once proud vessel, forever at anchor, used to hold the prisoners who would not fit in the gales on land. "Hatches are closed, see?" she would say, pointing. "Hatches are closed. Why do you think that is?" "They don't want them to escape." "They stink too badly. Decent people don't need to be smelling it." Sometimes Molly looked at her grandmother's face when the old woman wasn't aware, nodding by the fire, needlework forgotten in her lap. There was still a hint of the softness Molly remembered, the sad smile of the woman who had lifted her from the edge of her father's grave and brought her to the safety of her hearth. There was an almost imperceptible hardening the first time Molly returned to her grandmother's home with a torn skirt after a misadventure involving a fence that was begging to be scaled. Over time, that softness coagulated into something new, a landscape of frowns and pursed lips accentuated by every transgression, every failure, every outright refusal to fold one's hands in one's lap, to scrub the floor, to tend the fire. If only she could be like Nancy. Nancy was perfect. Or, at least, everyone thought she was.